what I'd like to do is thank the David Westphall Foundation, and we're fortunate enough to have Walter Westphall here. And sir, talking to you and your wife, and absolutely thrilled to be here, and thank you for coming and to commemorate. Because your mission, as I went on and I did some research, the purpose of the David Westphall Veterans Foundation is to honor U.S. military members and veterans and acknowledge their sacrifices and educate Americans about the responsibility of citizenship and the high costs of freedom. And if there's something we need in this country more of, is more of that. Is more of that. And that's what, and that mission statement folds in very nicely to what we do here at the Marines Memorial, the Associated Foundation, is to educate, commemorate, and serve. And that education piece, freedom doesn't come cheap. And unfortunately in this country where we've gotten the dialogue, the dialogue seems to, has stopped, the moderation has stopped, and it's either up or down, left or right. As you walk through these halls and you see those photos on the wall of those men and women that came before us that did sacrifice for the ability for us to be here today, can't be understated. So again, thank you for what you do. And Walter, thanks for what you do with the foundation and bringing this here to us and enjoying that, reiterating that mission of reminding it what it is to be an American. So that's hugely important. It's certainly important to me and to the folks associated with the hotel. So our moderator, Dick, was a Huey pilot, and I talked to him a little bit about that. My background is Cobra's in the Marine Corps, but I do have about 500 hours in the Huey, and he was in Vietnam, and then he left, went and joined the Air National Guard, and then retired, New Mexico National Guard, and retired back in, it was 2009.
I'm an old timer now.
Well, you look great, and you dress very sharply. But it is absolute pleasure, and it's amazing whenever I speak to folks like Steve or Walter or Dick, you know, wherever your background, wherever you came from, there's always that similarity. If you served the same purposeful, there's always that familiarity with what you are, who you are, how you think, and what is important. And it's absolutely an honor. And of course, again, I will say, Steve, Dr. Trout, thank you for being here. Looking forward to hearing your words, but I won't take any of the Dick's introductions away. But again, to all of you, to the members there, and to the foundation folks that are here, and then just to the guests who came in to listen to the presentation, I truly want to thank you for your commitment to the Marines Memorial, your commitment to the David Westphall Foundation, and your commitment to this country. Thank you.
Well, good evening. Once again, I'm Dick Dickerson. It's an honor and a pleasure and a privilege to be here. I'm here to do a couple of things, to try to introduce an individual who wants me to keep the remarks of introduction extremely short, so he has the time to speak to you about a foundation, a memorial, a place on a mountaintop in New Mexico that I think after you see a little vignette here and hear the words of Dr. Stephen Trout, you'll want to make plans to get there yourself. My introduction will be very short of Dr. Stephen Trout, but I will say this. I had the great pleasure of meeting Walter's father on many occasions as a younger person in New Mexico and living in Santa Fe and traveling up to Angel Fire, which was about 2 hours away. And I would find this phenomenal facility on a hill that you just can't miss. The beauty and grandeur of the Moreno Valley, where the memorial is, to me was only surpassed by this, at that point in time, small man who walked up to me on a cane and had a hat on and said, "Hello, son, my name's Doc." And he had me at hello, son, as they say in the movies. This was 1985, and I had been out of Nam since the end of '70, and I came back, I took off my uniform, I put that behind me, as so many veterans did. But things like war don't just stay in the background. They come back, and for many veterans, they will haunt you, as I realized it was haunting me. And I found someone I could talk to in Doc Westfall. That story can probably be repeated by thousands and thousands of Vietnam and probably some World War II and Korean veterans as well. Doc put together something called the Peace and Brotherhood Chapel, again, which you'll hear about and you'll see in just a moment. Key word to me, peace. That place brought me and many veterans peace. So to me, that's what this is all about. That's what a gentleman who has never been in the military has done such a phenomenal job of capturing in words and doing the research that a book can now live on, telling us about this wonderful memorial and this wonderful family who put such a phenomenal facility together. There are 4 board members here, myself, Walter Westfall, Jimmy Hall, and Chuck Howe. Would you 3 gentlemen stand, please? With a little bit of coaxing, I'm sure they'd be happy to give you a personal tour of that memorial if you show up there. So that's an invitation, folks, and it's made very sincerely. Again, a great gentleman from the University of Alabama. I can't help but say it, Roll Tide. Stephen, the podium's yours.
What an absolute thrill to be in this magnificent living memorial to talk about another magnificent living memorial, namely the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Angel Fire, New Mexico. I've just been in awe of this amazing hotel. And as I've told a number of people, I went on a self-guided tour yesterday. I started on the 12th floor, and I worked my way all the way down to the lobby and looked at every photograph and every plaque and every exhibit and every artifact and was just in awe of this amazing structure. So very, very happy to be here. This simply would not have been possible without the hard work of my new friend David Mantei. David simply made this happen. He became involved with the memorial in New Mexico. He knew that this would be an absolutely wonderful venue to have a book talk, and so he reached out and he talked to Mackenzie and others here at the site and made it happen. And so I'm deeply grateful to you, David, and David and his lovely wife, Sarah, have put so much time and effort into bringing everyone here for this very special event. I also want to thank Dick Dickerson for that introduction. And I also want to thank Dick for this amazing photograph featured on the cover of the book. I think it's the most beautiful, the most haunting photograph ever taken of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Angel Fire. Some months before the book was published, I was having an email exchange with my editor at the University Press of Kansas, my dear friend Joyce Harrison, and she said, you know, for the cover of this book, we need an image that is going to just shout out to someone from 20 feet away, you need to come over and pick up this book and learn more about this memorial in New Mexico. And when I sent her Dick's photograph, I received a 2-word response, and it simply read, mission accomplished. So it's an amazing image, and there are other images that Dick provided for the book as well that you'll see should you pick it up. Finally, I want to thank Mackenzie Jacobic and Chris Tavuchis for their tremendous hospitality and making us feel so at home here at the memorial, and of course General Rocco as well. So what I would like to do in a presentation that's going to run about an hour and 35 minutes, I'm kidding, in a talk that's going to run, I hope, about 40 minutes, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I discovered the site in New Mexico, and then I'm going to talk about the story of the family who created the memorial. There are many people in this room who know this story very, very well and in greater detail than I do, and they're immediately going to notice that important facts are omitted and dimensions of the story are not going to be included, and that's simply because of the time constraint that I'm trying to operate within. So if you want to learn more, there's a book out there that will contain some more information for you. So I'm going to try to race through a lot of this because I'd like to leave myself 5 minutes at the end, if you'll indulge me, to read a couple passages from the book, and that will hopefully give you a sense of its flavor. As we all know, there is one National Vietnam Veterans Memorial in the United States of America. It was created by the brilliant architect Maya Lin, and it was dedicated in Washington, D.C. in 1982, and of course it's located on the National Mall. But actually what I've just said is not correct. There are two National Vietnam Veterans Memorials in the United States, and there's one that predates this memorial by more than a decade. And I'm referring to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Angel Fire. Until 2011, I knew absolutely nothing about that original Vietnam Veterans Memorial. In fact, I didn't even know that it existed. I discovered it entirely by accident when my wife and I were taking a vacation in the mountains of north central New Mexico. And we were staying in the town of Taos in a lovely bed and breakfast called the Adobe Pines. And one morning we decided to drive a scenic route that's popular with tourists in the area called the Enchanted Circle. And you see the Enchanted Circle there on the right. And if you drive it in a clockwise motion, it will take you north into the high desert near the Rio Grande River Gorge. Then it turns east. It ascends up into the forested slopes of the Sangre de Cristo, the Blood of Christ Mountains. And then you go over a pass, Bobcat Pass, and you drop down into the Moreno Valley, which is flanked on one side by Wheeler Peak, which is the highest point in the state of New Mexico, and on the other by an additional range of mountains to the east. The Moreno Valley is open grassland, stunningly beautiful. The wind blows there all the time. It's a lovely, haunting place. And as you continue south through the valley, you pass on your left a ribbon of gray, usually white-capped water that's called Eagle Nest Lake. And then when you go even further south and you've come to the point where the road bends west again to take you back into Taos, you'll see a sign off on the right-hand side that says Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and it's at the base of a hill with a small road that leads up to the summit. Now, actually, when I saw that sign in 2011, that's not what it said. It said Vietnam Veterans Memorial State Park, because at that time in the memorial's history, it was run by the New Mexico Park Service. The memorial was founded by one family. I'm going to be talking about them, but it's also been affiliated with a number of public institutions. I will not be getting into that at all. But if you have any interest in that, I'll be more than happy to answer questions. I have an obsession with memorials. I might as well confess this to you. And it's an obsession that has become something of an annoyance for my better half. And so wherever we go, I always see a memorial and I have to check it out. And my wife, who becomes narcoleptic whenever we drive in the mountains, is usually perfectly content to remain in the car and to take a nice nap while I check out whatever memorial has caught my eye. In this case, however, as we went up this little road leading to the top of the hill, she woke up, looked out the front windshield and said, "Oh my God," and then proceeded to accompany me as we walked through this extraordinary site where we spent nearly 2 hours. After going through the chapel and the visitor center and looking at the commemorative statuary and the remembrance bricks and everything else at this remarkable memorial, when we went back to our car, I said to my wife, if no one has written a book about this place, I'm going to. And my wife, who puts up with my writerly projects, but has varying degrees of enthusiasm when it comes to them, because they're always at the expense of home maintenance projects that really shouldn't be put off and other things that I should be doing. In this case, at the end of our 2-hour expedition at the memorial, she said, "That's exactly what you should do." And she was very, very supportive and excited about this project during the 9 years that I spent researching and writing this book. So what did we see on this day? Well, I can race through these slides because you have a nice orientation from that 3-minute video that gives you a sense, even an overhead view of the memorial. So you walk from the parking lot along a paved pathway that's lined in places by commemorative bricks that we're all familiar with from various American memorials. You pass a garden that has beautiful wildflowers from the southern Rocky Mountain region. There's a statue of an American serviceman in Vietnam writing a letter or trying to write a letter home to describe what he's seeing. There's a Huey UH-1 helicopter mounted on a stand as if lifting off. This is to your right as you enter the park. Absolutely magnificent craft, fully restored a number of years ago. David Mante's company played a role in that, repainting this storied aircraft. This particular helicopter was known as the Viking Surprise when it served in Vietnam, and it was involved in combat operations for a number of years, actually, in the Vietnam conflict. And at one point, it was involved in an operation in the Mekong River Delta where it took more than 130 enemy rounds, including 6 that entered the cockpit area. So it's a remarkable artifact and would be worth a visit, really, on its own. But once you go past the helicopter and the statue and the garden, you come to this thing, which is very, very difficult for people to describe. In my book, I said it looks like a structure left behind by extraterrestrials, of eerie, otherworldly, uncanny place, like no other place I've been to in North America. What you're looking at is a non-denominational chapel that was created by a New Mexico family, first of all, to pay tribute to a lost loved one, secondly, to honor all Americans, the living and the dead, who had served in the Vietnam War, and third, it represents a call for world peace. And it has 2 wings. It's a goal-like structure. You saw in the aerial footage that there is an amphitheater where various activities can be held. This is a view of the chapel looking toward the east. So this is a view from the west side. You can see the magnificent view that it commands of the Moreno Valley. This is the chapel as seen from the north. The spire-like prominence that you're looking at in the front of this building is about 50 feet high. And the little narrow ribbon of glass that runs alongside it, which provides the only interior light, except for that which you receive from the 2 glass doors on each side, is maybe 2 feet wide. This is the view of the chapel from the south, and this is probably the most photographed perspective on the chapel, looking at it from the east. An absolutely magnificent structure, but again, one that seems to elude language. Who built it and why? This is the Westphall family in a photograph taken in Albuquerque in 1949. We see Victor Westphall standing on the left. Victor was a successful home builder in the Albuquerque area, also a veteran of the Pacific Theater in the Second World War. He served in the U.S. Navy from 1943 until 1945, had the position during most of that time of naval postmaster. Served on an island in the Solomons, was on the island of Leyte in the Philippines, and ultimately stationed in Borneo in Indonesia. That's his wife, Jean, posing next to him. They married in 1938. They met in Milwaukee. That's his son, David, over on the far right. David was born in 1940, and the youngest son, Walter, looking very much as he does today, up there in the front, born in 1942. The Westfalls were not always denizens of New Mexico. They actually spent many of their early years in Wisconsin. Victor Westphall was born near the town of Hebron in 1913. And he's a remarkable man with a remarkable biography. He was educated in a one-room schoolhouse. He went on to Milwaukee, where he received teaching credentials and a degree in art history. He was both an intellectual and an athlete. I have no claim whatsoever to one and only a dubious claim to the other, but a remarkable man who combined physicality and athleticism with a life of the mind. So a voracious reader, a compulsive writer, a student his entire life, and a teacher, but also a weightlifting champion who won prizes in his division and who revered physical fitness and would encourage his sons to pursue athletics as well. So you see Victor over on the right-hand side during their Wisconsin days in one of his strongman poses, and he's holding David aloft with two hands in that remarkable image. I have an image later of Victor Westphall when he was 80 years old, and I want you to keep this image in the back of your mind when you see that one. That's Jean, who was a loving homemaker, wonderful mother to David and to Walter. This is a photograph taken in the mid-1940s where she's out with David. And then on the right-hand side, we have my favorite photograph of the Westfalls. Jean was almost certainly the photographer. That's why she's not in the image. But you see Walter over there on the left-hand side, Victor in the center, and David on the right-hand side. They have just made a 1,500-mile trek from the Milwaukee area to Albuquerque, New Mexico. They did this in 1946. That year, doctors detected tuberculosis lesions in Jean's lungs, and they recommended that she move to a high, dry climate. Albuquerque was, of course, just the thing. Once they arrived there, Victor enrolled in the University of New Mexico and pursued a master's degree in history, followed by a PhD in American civilization, what we would today call American studies. They wanted to live near campus and live as cheaply as possible, so they parked this trailer, which had 11 blowouts during their 1,500-mile journey. They parked the trailer near some inexpensive land near the campus, and at this moment, Victor Westphall, who had already demonstrated impressive intellectual achievements and athleticism, demonstrated that he also had the instincts of a successful businessman. He created a garage for the family to keep their vehicle in, which he erected next to their trailer, which they continued to live in. Then he built a house attached to the garage, sold the land and the house and the garage at a profit, turned around and bought a few other lots, did the same thing over again. Within a few months, he was partnered with a contractor in the Albuquerque area, and the two men went on to construct more than 2,000 tract homes, most of them for recently discharged GIs who were taking advantage of the low-interest home loans that were part of the Serviceman's Readjustment Act of 1944, AKA the GI Bill. That building enterprise made the Westfalls a wealthy family. By 1952, they were able to move into this residence, a little snazzier than the trailer, which is in the foothills of the Sandia Mountains overlooking the Albuquerque metropolitan area. And their house, which was custom built, was featured in a 1952 issue of the New Mexico Sun Trails magazine. And that's where I found these two wonderful photographs. And so in the image on the left, you see Victor up there on the balcony, again, looking like the burly weightlifter, which he was. He's looking out on the living room, which he helped to design in this extraordinary home. And then on the right, you can see that the house was perched literally on the side of a rocky hillside. The family owned about 70 acres of this rock-covered hillside. So just an extraordinary place for David and Walter to grow up. The boys, of course, came to think of themselves very quickly as New Mexicans. And David developed into a very complex, and I found ultimately extremely likable young man. Like his father, he combined the life of the mind and athleticism. He was a talented runner. He set track records, and he also was a talented football player. You see him here in a photograph that appeared in an Albuquerque newspaper in the late 1950s. He's number 35, carrying the football representing the Highland High School team in Albuquerque at that time. In addition to playing football, David played classical guitar. He was a classical music lover. He enjoyed languages, literature, philosophy, history. Very much a person, I think, who took after his father in many respects. This is David perhaps 7 or 8 years later. And we see him here pursuing his studies at the University of Montana in Missoula. And a lot had happened to David during those 7 or 8 years. For one thing, because of a major athletic disappointment when he played football for the University of New Mexico, he impulsively joined the United States Marine Corps. And he did so as an enlisted man, and he served from 1959 until 1963. He also impulsively became involved in another institution that people turn to when they're looking for answers to their problems, namely marriage. And his marriage, unfortunately, did not work out, and by the middle of the 1960s, he was divorced. David also began to develop psychological problems that he would deal with throughout his life, and there's evidence that many of these emerged when he was a child, and they were certainly exacerbated by the situation with his marriage and by other stressful factors in his life. But by 1966, he had entered what I refer to in the book as a kind of idyll. He had to leave the University of Montana to go home to receive psychiatric treatment following the breakup of the marriage. It seemed to restore him to health, and he regained his confidence, and he returned to the University of Montana, and I think he was perhaps the happiest he had ever been. He was pursuing a teaching degree, again in the humanities, with Spanish and history and Russian as his areas of emphasis. He was making straight A's. He was absolutely dazzling his professors with his conservative views. Many of them were liberals and opposed to the war in Vietnam. David was a true Cold Warrior in favor of American intervention in Vietnam, a true believer in the notion that communism would have to be stopped one potential domino at a time. And so he was an amazing student during this period. He also fell in love, perhaps for the first time in his life. He went to a language institute in Mexico where he met a young woman, a Mexican teacher. They became infatuated, and they had a passionate correspondence, which was underway for nearly 2 years. But all the while that David is enjoying this period of relative calm and contentment in his life, brewing in the background is a growing desire to re-enter the Marine Corps and to serve his country in Vietnam. And I speculate in the book about why David felt this way, and I could offer a number of reasons, but one of the most important, I think, is I suspect that he felt a sense of obligation to the young men with whom he had served during the pre-Vietnam period from 59 to 63. And many of those individuals that he had served with were still in the Marine Corps, and now they were deployed in Vietnam. In Vietnam, by 1966, was not the splendid little war that Philip Caputo was anticipating when he was among the first Marines to land in Da Nang during the American escalation of manpower in 1965. It was increasingly a deadly experience for Marines, and particularly for Marine junior officers. So I think David probably felt a strong sense of obligation. So by January 1967, he re-enters the Corps. He completes OCS. He completes the Marine Corps' famous basic school. And on Halloween Day, 1967, he arrives in Vietnam, arrives in Da Nang. He anticipated that he would be attached to a reconnaissance unit. That's actually what he was trained for. But oddly enough, things don't always go as planned in the military, or so I'm told. And instead, he became a platoon commander. And he was assigned to a platoon in Bravo Company of the 1st Battalion of the 4th Marine Regiment, or in Marine parlance familiar to many people in this room, simply B-14. David would spend 7 months in Vietnam leading that platoon through numerous firefights and also plenty of periods of inactivity. And he would see most of his tour of duty up to the end of his life in I Corps, First Corps, the northernmost sector in the Vietnam War to be occupied by American forces. His adversaries there would not be Viet Cong, they would be members of the North Vietnamese Regular Army. And this particular northernmost sector is right next to the demilitarized zone. This map was clipped out of a magazine or a newspaper by David Westphall. He sent 30 letters home during his 7 months in Vietnam. They're absolutely extraordinary letters. I read them over and over and over again. And even if I had not been working on this particular project, I would have been impressed by them in terms of the insights they contained and the quality of the writing. So in one of his letters, to give his parents a better sense of where he is and what he's doing, he included this clipping. That's David's handwriting. You see where he has an arrow, B-14 presently at C2, which was an outpost outside of the stronghold at Con Thien. You see up above, closer to the DMZ, where he's marked where he's been in an operation. This is the last known photograph of David Westphall. David Westphall was killed in an ambush on May 22nd, 1968. And writing about his death is probably the hardest thing I've ever done as a writer. It was a very, very difficult thing. When you write a book with characters as vivid as the ones that I tried to present, you feel you know them almost as well as flesh and blood people in your own life. And I certainly felt that way about David Westphall. News of his death reached his parents on May 27th. 2 uniformed Marine Corps officers went out to the San Marino Valley to deliver the news. Now, by this point in the family's history, Victor's home building operation had moved from the Albuquerque area up into the Sangre de Cristos. And he was working on a golf course community that would be located on the western side of the Moreno Valley. And it was called the Valverde Ranch, okay? And so that's where the Marine Corps officers delivered their news, and that's where the Westphall parents were living at this point. By June 10th, the funeral was held for David in Albuquerque, and then a procession of mourners drove down the highway to Santa Fe, and David was interred in the National Veterans Cemetery there, where he remains to this day. 2 days after the funeral, the surviving family members were talking about the best way to pay tribute to David's memory. At first, they considered establishing a scholarship at the University of New Mexico, perhaps in one of the humanities fields that David so loved. And then Jean Westphall, David's mother, came up with an idea that, as I point out in the book, I think changed their lives perhaps every bit as profoundly as losing David did. Her suggestion was that they build a non-denominational chapel on a hill that jutted out from the Valverde Ranch property out into the valley, commanding a panoramic view of the entire area, with Angel Fire in the distance, the ski resort community, and Eagle Nest Lake and Eagle Nest Village to the north. And this idea came together very, very quickly. And again, it would be a 3-pronged effort. The family decided on this very, very quickly. They would honor David, they would also pay tribute to all who had served in Vietnam, and they would create a structure that would make an urgent call for world peace. And they called this structure the Vietnam Veterans Peace and Brotherhood Chapel. And by 1970, this is what it looked like. This is the basic structure. You can see it's constructed out of cinder blocks. It was ultimately covered with stucco that Victor Westphall wanted to give the appearance of adobe. He felt that this was a connection that could be made with indigenous architecture and with indigenous peoples in this region of New Mexico. Building it was an absolute nightmare. Their contractor, George Vettler, in the time-tested manner of contractors before and since, gave an overly optimistic estimate of how long it would take to construct it. He figured about 3 months. It took 3 years. At one point in 1969, the half-completed structure was nearly blown off its hilltop position by hurricane-force winds barreling down the Moreno Valley during a winter storm. The Westfalls used David Westphall's life insurance, the payment from his life insurance policy, to construct this memorial. And they also felt that their pockets were probably deep enough to keep it going indefinitely. They miscalculated. The memorial wound up costing the family almost every single thing that they had. And the challenge to keep it in place, to keep its funding, to keep it going would cost the family dearly over the coming years. This is a photograph of Victor Westphall living on site as the memorial is being constructed. This was probably taken around the time of the image that I just showed you. One of the most difficult things for me to deal with when writing this book, I think it was difficult for me, and I think it was difficult for Walter when he and I would talk about his family's story. I wanted to capture in the book the duality of this experience, that on the one hand, this was an incredibly ennobling, heroic narrative that I had to write about an American family who were doing something extraordinary, honoring servicemen, the living and the dead, also urgently calling for world peace, and doing so while the Vietnam War is still underway, and initiating that in 1968, which is a year that sees the United States just ripped apart over the issue of Vietnam. And so it's a tremendously decent and admirable thing that the Westfalls were engaged in, and I have tremendous admiration for all of them. At the same time, it was destructive. It was destructive to this family, and it created a terrible burden for all of them. Victor Westphall became absolutely obsessed with this memorial to the point that it led him to become estranged from his wife, Jean. And so he actually moved to the memorial site. He saw her infrequently. They later reconciled much later in life and are in fact buried side by side at the memorial today. But it weakened their marriage. And it led him to become so fixated on this site and so identified with it that it became his entire life. Again, duality. That was really good for Vietnam veterans who went to Angel Fire and met with Victor and were instantly understood by him and instantly felt, in some cases, healed through their interactions with him. But it came at a terrible cost to his family. Jean suffered from mental illness that was exacerbated by the loss of her son, and then, I think, by the loss of her husband to this memorial. And then also, this entire memorial enterprise became a tremendous burden, I think, for Walter, that to some extent he has borne to this very day. So that duality was difficult to write about and difficult to talk about, but I felt it was part of the story that needed to be told, and I think that Walter felt the same way. In 1979, the memorial was profiled in a story in Parade magazine. Many of you in this room are old enough to remember Parade magazine. It was an arts and culture weekly that was inserted into the Sunday edition of newspapers all over the United States. I have what's probably a false planted memory, because I've worked on Angel Fire for so long now, it's become my own obsession. I have what's probably a false planted memory of being 15 years old in 1979 and reading this article. I'd like to think that that actually happened, but I'm not certain. Michael Satchell, a British journalist, wrote this piece, and it probably more than anything else in the 1970s catapulted the memorial to national prominence. So many people read about the memorial. It also turned out to be a controversial article that brought up a controversial dimension of the site. Victor Westphall felt so strongly that this memorial should both honor people who had served in Vietnam and promote the cause of world peace, that in his interview with Satchell, he said that if the person who had pulled the trigger on the gun that had killed David Westphall, if that person had in turn been killed, he would put his photograph on the wall of the chapel at this memorial. That did not go over well with many readers of Parade magazine, including other parents who had lost family members in Vietnam and many Vietnam War veterans who felt that that simply wasn't an appropriate response. But it gives you some idea of the force of Victor Westphall's convictions. The piece also featured two remarkable photographs taken by Michael Satchell that I just want to pause and reflect on for a moment because they're in such sharp contrast with one another. If you look at the image on the left, it's an outdoor image of Victor seated in front of this memorial, filled with energy and purpose. He looks like a mystic or like a seer. You can almost imagine the memorial materializing out of his sheer willpower or out of his imagination behind him. Contrast that with the image on the right-hand side, which is taken in the interior of the memorial. Usually, the tradition became featuring David's image, including the image of David in the dress uniform that I showed you just a moment ago. Typically, that image would be featured in the chapel along with 12 other images that would be rotated. But there was a period in the late 1970s when that idea was modified, and over 100 images of American KIAs were featured on the rear wall in the interior of the chapel. And as I point out in the book, Victor looks absolutely crushed by the weight of that grief and of that loss. And he looks into the camera with an empty expression. And it's almost hard to realize that this is the same man as the individual who's been photographed in the image on the left. So again, duality, both the power and the cost of this place. Walter is also a Vietnam veteran. And he went on to fly KC-135 fuel tanker planes in the Vietnam theater. He had 2 90-day tours of duty, but by 1973, he had had enough of the political and military leadership of the American war in Vietnam, and he left the Air Force. And then for a period, he drifted. He was uncertain what to do, how to move past the loss of his brother, how to move past this memorial which had become such a responsibility, such a burden. But by 1975, he really found his bearings. He completed an MBA at the University of Denver, and he got a position in Wichita with the Federal Home Loan Bank Board. And in 1985, he married his wife, Dorothy, who's here with him today. And I'll have an image of the family here in a moment, one of the happier stories I could tell in an otherwise often difficult and mournful narrative. So there he is early in his Air Force training days. In 1994, when Victor Westphall was 80 years old, he accompanied Walter was in his 50s at this point, on a pilgrimage to the ambush site near Con Thien, where David had been killed in 1968. They were accompanied by 2 other Vietnam veterans. I ask you to hold that image of Victor in his strongman pose, lifting David aloft with this photograph. And what I think is so remarkable about this image is you see how, on the one hand, how frail Victor Westphall had become by this point in his life. He was dealing with the ravages of serious arthritis, which became even more debilitating later in his life. But you sense from his stride there, and even what you can detect of the body language from the back, that he's moving forward with a great purpose and with great energy. And again, I think it tells you something about the man. And then a happy image from 2013. This photograph was taken in the Visitor Center at the memorial at Angel Fire, with Walter on the left, with his wife Dorothy, and their son David, who is now a 2nd lieutenant in the United States Army. David named after the uncle he never knew. And then their daughter Kimberly, who recently became a mother, and a wonderful photograph of the family at that point. And there's one more twist in the family story, which I think is really quite poignant and interesting. David's wife, Chi, her maiden name is Nom Chi Vu, is the proud daughter of immigrants who came to this country from South Vietnam as a direct result, of course, of the conflict there. History has a strange way of weaving in and out of people's lives, and so the Vietnam conflict, which cost this family so much, also provided them with a beloved daughter-in-law. And what do you do with that kind of mystery? I have no idea, but I wanted to show you this image. I'm happy to stop now, or if you'd like to hear a couple passages from the book, I'd be happy to read them. What would you like? Okay. So I'm going to read you 2 short passages. One is from the chapter on David's service in Vietnam. And again, I was fascinated by his letters and very impressed by his abilities as a writer. So here's a section where I talk about his correspondence. And I don't talk about what he has to say about military operations or policy or anything else. Instead, I talk about what he asked his parents for, because this, to me, more than anything else, brought him to life in my mind. In all, David wrote 30 letters to family members while in Vietnam, 22 to his parents and 8 to his brother. All show the Westfall flair for composition. Those written to Walter often cover the same material as those addressed to Jean and Victor, but they typically run longer and perhaps offer a somewhat more candid record of David's experiences and attitudes. Understandably, there were things he couldn't bring himself to tell his parents, and Walter, he knew, would be discreet. For the historian seeking to reconstruct the experiences of Marines along the DMZ in 1967 and 1968, this body of correspondence represents a veritable treasure trove. But David himself comes most to life in the details, in the little things that have nothing to do with his accounts of ambushes, defense preparations, or tallies of enemy dead. For example, he frequently asked, sometimes pleaded for his parents to send him things. Sometimes the items are minor creature comforts, but just as frequently they were pieces of equipment that the resource-starved Marine Corps could not issue or did not think to issue. In his letter dated November 16, 1967, David requests, quote, a good whistle with chain, preferably not shiny. Another pair of leather gloves, preferably black. Just a dab of red cellophane. For use as a night filter on a pen light, perhaps? Vitamin C. Notebook paper, as per the enclosed sample. A giant-size, fine-line black Papermate pen refill. Mustache wax. Parentheses, very important. A small calendar. Contact paper, which is clear adhesive sheets, rolls rather, of thin plastic indispensable for protecting maps. Most important, and with the highest priority, 3 or 4 boxes of Bit-O-Honey candy bars. And if possible, some raisins, some almonds, and if possible, some beef or deer jerky or the like. By December 28, most of the requested items had arrived, but some appear to have been stolen. Could Jean and Walter send the following? Another 1968 calendar, and more socks. Also the same size notebook paper you sent, green dye, candles, automatic grease pencils, 4 or 5 pairs of size 11 inner soles, parentheses, emerging priority. Separate packages per pair might ensure quicker delivery, as might absence of any special arrangements other than regular airmail, into parentheses. And batteries, both pen light and regular size. He explained that the mustache wax he requested earlier was a joke. In his letter from February 3rd, 1968, David hates to be, quote, always importuning, end of quote, but he is in desperate need of, among other things, hankies and Hoppy's No. 9 gun cleaning solvent, as well as .45 caliber bore cleaning patches. Does the Marine Corps give people anything? Pipe cleaners and some Kool-Aid or Tang and more Bit-O-Honeys. In the same letter, he asked his parents to check on his subscription to Playboy magazine, and to send along, quote, a bottle of Kahlua and some glasses or a bottle of brandy, end of quote. Having now acquired a taste for liquor, he would, along with his fellow officers, receive a number of libation-bearing care packages over the next few weeks until divisional headquarters put a stop to the practice. Perhaps the most ironic item that David requested from his parents is a poster-sized map of Vietnam from National Geographic. Military maps, he explained, give absolutely no sense of his location in relation to the country as a whole. When the map finally arrived, David couldn't wait to pin it to the wall of his dugout. His place in Vietnam now made a little more sense, at least geographically. And my other passage comes from my account of the construction of the memorial and the difficulties that the Westfalls encountered. In August 1969, a year and 3 months after 2 Marine Corps captains had delivered their shattering news to the Westphall family, George Vettler's crew, George Vettler was the name of their contractor, finally completed the chapel's cinder block shell, probably the strangest looking building they would ever construct. Even in its rough form, the gigantic avant-garde structure dramatically altered the skyline west of Angel Fire and could be seen for miles in multiple directions, making it the talk, not always favorable talk, of the Moreno Valley. The only question now was whether the Westfalls would be able to support themselves after the chapel was finished. The problem was that while Victor and Jean had enough in their savings to cover the chapel's construction, and even thanks to David's life insurance payments, some of the additional expenses that would come later, their income had basically disappeared. Achieving a return on the Valverde land investment would have required fully developing the golf course and home sites, a task for which Victor now had neither the funds nor the time. Thus, in May, the Westfalls had made the difficult decision to sell the Valverde Ranch, into which they had poured most of their assets, to a Texas-based development company. All of the property had to go except for 5 acres set aside for the chapel. 1 month later, the two parties closed on the deal, which provided Victor and Jean with a significant cash buffer, just in case the long-term cost associated with the memorial grew higher than expected, which of course they did. But while the money was welcome, the sale marked the end of Victor's construction business, and it placed a cap on their resources. The latter caused Victor to wonder constantly whether he and Jean would be able to spend their, quote, declining years with a modicum of comfort and dignity, end of quote. Would their memorial enterprise leave them with anything? And now, with the first phase of construction complete, Victor could see a new tidal wave of expenses rushing toward him. The situation was overwhelming. The chapel still needed window and door frames, a layer of roofing material, stucco finishing within and without, flooring, a furnace, interior and exterior lighting, a sound system, apparatus for the internal flame, a sign near the highway at the base of the hill, and a host of smaller items that even Victor, an experienced builder, could barely keep track of. And beyond everything else, the matter of upkeep loomed. The winter climate in the Sangre de Cristos had already demonstrated what it could do to an exposed building at 8,500 feet. How would the Westfalls deal with the inevitable wear and tear that mountain conditions would inflict in the future? Like all who build memorials, they wanted theirs to be permanent. This required funding for ongoing maintenance. Where would it come from? Final thing I'd like to say about this memorial is that for me, what makes it so special and what makes it one of the most important memorials in the United States is the way that it weaves together, and you feel this when you're there. You feel the power of this place and of its narrative when you're in its presence. It brings together a raw family story, a raw family experience that you feel so tangibly when you're there that you almost feel like an interloper, almost as if it's something that you shouldn't be as close to as you are when you visit this memorial. And yet it takes that personal story of one family's loss and it fits it within the larger story of American losses in Vietnam. And you feel these two things at once. You're torn in these two different directions of being reminded of something very personal and specific, and yet at the same time understanding the place of that story within the larger narrative. And I don't know of any other place in the United States that has that kind of power or operates in that kind of way. My final slide is simply an image of the logo for the David Westphall Veterans Foundation. I've been grateful to them for their support throughout this. And of course, the logo of the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Alabama. And I guess I will say roll Tide. So thank you all very much.
Stephen reminded me the first time we met was on a bench at the memorial, 2013. And so I had some time to reflect on that meeting. And as I mentioned how I was just engrossed by the presence of Doc Westfall in 1985, this gentleman caught my attention as well. And has done such a phenomenal, put such energy and created such a phenomenal capture of a story of an American family and a memorial that if you ever see it, you will never forget. And it just may change your life. Okay, questions. Who was the architect and how did the Westfalls select this person?
Yeah, forgive me, I meant to tell you who the architect was. The architect is an award-winning New Mexico architect by the name of Ted Luna. And I can't answer the question off the top of my head of why him and how the family came to select him. If you want to ask Walter about that afterwards, he may be able to shed some light on that. But I know that Victor in particular was thrilled by the avant-garde modern design of this structure. And when Luna first laid out the blueprints of the structure, the family members were just dazzled by it. And then he constructed a scale model of it to give them an even better sense of what it would look like. And they were just in awe of it. So Ted Luna, who is still active as an architect in New Mexico, was the artist who created it.
Next question. Did your research cause you to change or alter your views about deploying young Americans to fight wars the country refuses to win?
Can you repeat the last part of that?
Views about deploying young Americans to fight wars the country refuses to win.
Well, I won't get into the issue of refusing to win wars. I think in general that it has always bothered me as a person who spent his career studying armed conflict, and particularly the way that it gets memorialized and commemorated. It's always bothered me to see young people deployed in any war under any circumstances. And I think the thing that has bothered me the most probably about our 21st century military conflicts is the way that there seems to be a disconnect between our society at home and the kinds of things we're asking those young people to do, and in our 21st century wars, asking them to do over and over and over and over again. And I think this issue of multiple deployments is something that a lot of Americans don't fully understand, or they haven't taken enough time to really learn about. But that's a profound change in the character of war as it is experienced by someone. And that's a different experience than what soldiers had in Vietnam. It's a somewhat different experience than what we've seen in other 20th century wars. So I've always taken very seriously and taken to heart you know, the loss of people in wartime, and so I don't know that my research on the memorial changed my views on that necessarily so much as reinforced them, because this was the first time in my career when I wrote a book that was as driven by narrative and as driven by the story, particularly of one remarkable young man and of his remarkable father and mother and his remarkable brother. And so that really touched me. And so I don't know that my intellectual understanding of war and loss and sacrifice was changed, but maybe my emotional understanding of it was perhaps profoundly impacted. I hope that answers the question.
And a follow-up to that as well. Would you advise your students to serve their country, and in what manner is that best done?
Well, I'm in the bizarre position of never having served in the military, and yet I think a draft would probably be a good thing. I think, again, this disconnect between those who serve and those who don't, and the ease with which Americans can kind of tune out what people in the military are experiencing, both in the field and after they come home, and have to deal with the often terrible legacy of that, which you referred to, Dick. I think that's a real problem, and so I think that our society, in my opinion, would benefit from something like that. And maybe it's if people don't serve in the military, they have some other form of public service, maybe as an option. Maybe fighting climate change. That seems like that's kind of a good idea at the moment, or other things. But I do think that some form of national service would be important. It's nothing that I experienced, and I feel in some respects that I missed out as a result of that. So that's my response to that. Yeah.
Thank you. There's one other item we need to take care of. I want to speak on behalf of the Westfall Foundation as a board member. It is with so much pleasure this story is presented the first time by the author at the Marine Corps Memorial Club. I believe there is an opportunity to forge a very strong relationship between the club and the memorial in Angel Fire. General Rocco, you have heard what one young man did and his needs. He was just a human being in a tough situation in Vietnam. He served his country well. He didn't want to die for his country, but he did. What a family went through because of that, that happens time and time again, as we all know. But one family responded above and beyond the call of duty. So again, if you and your wife would come forward, Chuck Howe, who is the past president of the foundation, we would like to present you with something. You and your wife. It is a family affair, sir. Back when we celebrated Doc's 100th anniversary, when he would have been 100 years old, he died. Walter, am I correct, when he was 89? Okay. So he was active till the very end. We had some coins struck, and they were numbered. As the military likes to do, is to coin individuals, present them with a coin that we hope will be meaningful and a lasting memory of the activity that they experienced. We hope this was a very good experience for you, sir, and you, ma'am, and your facility, and we hope that will carry over maybe in a stronger relationship with our foundation. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this presentation from Marines Memorial Association and Foundation. To learn more about the organization, visit marinesmemorial.org.